施瓦特博士。
Okay. So, howdy, I'm Dr. John Varshoot.
大家好，我的名字是约翰瓦舒特。
I'm a senior lecturer at Baylor University in the physics department.
我是贝勒大学物理高级讲师。
Baylor, if you don't know, is a Baptist institution. It's the world's largest Baptist college, and it's also probably one of the, if not the largest, evangelical research universities in the world.
对，如果您还不知道的话，那我们贝勒大学它是全世界最大的浸信会的大学，而且它有可能是世界上最大的福音派的基督教研究型的大学之一。
My area of research is what's known as complex plasma, or dirty plasma.
我的物理学的领域是复杂的等离子体。
Psalm 19 proclaimed that the heavens declare the glory of God.
诗篇19章第1节说，诸天述说神的荣耀。
And if you look up at the heaven, almost everything that you see is some type of what we call complex plasma.
您在天空当中能够看到的大部分的东西，大概都是由复杂的等离子体构成的。
Stars, nebulas.
比如说恒星啦，比如说星云啦。
The stuff in between the stars.
比如说星星之间、恒星之间的这些东西啦。
Just about everything is the complex plasma.
大概所有的这些东西，它都是从等离子体组成的。
And one of the things that I love about my area of research is when I see plasma, I can see the glories of heaven in a deeper way.
我所研究的这个领域让我很激动的事情，就是因为当我看到这些等离子体的时候，我觉得我更加的了解神的荣耀。
Anybody can look at these pictures and just see the glory of God and the power and majesty of God.
任何人看到这些图片，大概都应该能看到神的荣耀，他的荣耀，他的强大。
But when you understand it on a deeper level, it just makes it that much greater.
如果你能够从更深的角度能够去了解它、理解它的话，它会让你觉得它更加的有荣耀。
It was largely astronomy that grew me into science.
它就是天文学，然后建立在科学的基础上。
I was about 10 years old, and my mom got me this book, Astronomy Made Simple.
当我10岁的时候，我妈妈给我买了这本书，就是简明的天文学。
And it was simple for a college level, but I was 10 years old. I couldn't understand it mathematically.
它简明的水平是在大学的水平，但是我那时候是10岁，数学不太懂，所以我就没有办法看懂。
But about 2 years later, I'd taken a little bit more math in school and studied, and I could understand most of it.
但是在我过了2年，12岁的时候呢，我又学了一点数学，那我就开始读这本书，然后就发现我很喜欢。
And it was just fascinating to me that you had the glories of heaven, you have so much incredible stuff, and it could be described so realistically and so accurately with just a handful of equations and theories and whatnot.
所以那个时候我发现这么多的东西都可以这么简单的描述出来，真的是令人着迷，而且它那个数学公式都很奇妙。
When I got into high school and took physics, it just made it that much more incredible and that much more detailed.
当我高中学物理的时候，那我就觉得对它的喜爱的程度更加增加了，因为我了解了更多的细节。
One thing that I really liked about physics, even from the beginning, was you're trying to get an understanding of the role that God set up the universe.
我最喜欢物理这方面的原因，就是我可以开始了解上帝他建立宇宙万物的这些背后的规则。
And as I got into university, talked with more scientists, future scientists who are also Christian, that was often one of the main reasons why they got into physics and science.
那我上了大学以后，我跟这些大学的教授们跟他们聊啊，然后我就发现很多的人，他们之所以进入这个科学的领域，就是因为他们也是发现上帝建立的宇宙有规则。
One of the founders of the scientific revolution was a man named Francis Bacon.
那其中的一个就是著名的建立的这个科学的它的根基的这个其中的一个 founder 就是一个founder 他的名字叫做 弗朗西斯·培根他是其中的一个人物，很有名的人物。
And he talked about there being 2 books laid out before us to study.
然后他说呢，在我们的面前其实打开的是2本书。
One book was the book of Scripture, tells us how to live.
有一本书呢，就是圣经，它告诉我们怎么样行事为人。
The other book was the book of nature, of creation, which shows his power.
另外一本书呢，它就是我们的被造之物我们中国人翻译成自然，大自然。那么它显明的，它表达的是上帝的伟力，他的力量。
We also need the book of Scripture to know about how to get to God and whatnot. But the book of nature does show his power, his majesty to anyone who would look.
所以我们需要圣经，因为圣经它写得很明白，我们怎么样可以回到天父的那里去。但是我们也需要这个大自然，就是我们所说的创造的万物，因为这个它可以让我们看到了以后就知道上帝是多么的伟大和奇妙。
And as a science student, I just really enjoyed reading both books.
那我是一个学科学的，那我是非常非常激动的喜欢读这2本书，一个是圣经，一本是圣经，一本是被造的植物。
The 2 books had the same author, and so they work well together.
这2本书他们的作者是同一位，所以这2本书他们很完美的结合在一起。
But I knew there were many atheists who don't believe that way.
但是我知道有很多的无神论者，他们其实不是跟我持不同的观点。
There are a lot of atheists who say, well, science has disproven religion.
有很多的这些无神论者，他们说不对，科学它其实是显明那个宗教是无理的。
Some atheists would maintain that science and Christianity have always been at war with each other. They have always been against each other.
有的无神论者他们就这样声称说，其实科学还有宗教，特别是跟这个基督教，一直都是相当于处在战争状态，彼此敌对。
And that was not my experience. I saw how those 2 books came together as to complement each other.
但是从我个人的经验角度来讲，我觉得他们说的是不对的，因为我发现这2本书他们拥有同一位作者，他们很完美的，然后互相补充，然后他们就是合作的非常的好。
But it does raise the question, what exactly is the relationship between science and Christianity?
但是我们的确是要问这个问题，到底科学和宗教他们有什么，基督教和科学有什么关系？
Related to that question, why did modern science arise in Europe, specifically Western Europe?
跟这个问题相关的还有一个问题，就是为什么现代的科学好像主要是出现在欧洲，尤其是西部的欧洲？
Why did modern science start so suddenly around the 1600s?
那为什么现代的科学它是忽然间就起步于大概17世纪，就是16几几年？
There have been scientists throughout the history of the earth.
自从有这些问题的答案，其实 one more time.
There have been scientists very early times until before. I mean, China and India and Greece, they all had scientists.
就是自从有人类以来，我们就一直有科学，不管是哪一个国家，比如说欧洲也好，中国也好，印度也好，我们都有很多的科学家从开始有人类的时候就产生了科学。
There are many very, very clever people who discovered a lot about science, but it wasn't until around 1600s that science as a whole really took off.
对，就好多的这些非常聪明的人，聪明绝顶的人，他们在科学上面其实都有很多的建树，但是现代的科学大概是在17世纪的时候才突然间起步的。
Science as a whole really became systematic and developed.
科学作为一个整体，它是在那个时候开始整体的开始发展强大起来。
What were the conditions in the 17th century Europe that made that possible?
那么我们就想问一下，在17世纪的欧洲，尤其是西欧，到底是什么天时地利人和，是什么事情发生了，使得这些现代的科学一下子就腾飞了？
Why didn't that happen someplace else?
为什么这种腾飞没有发生在世界其他的角落？
15th century, 13th century Europe was not very technologically advanced.
我们再往前回溯一点点，15世纪、14世纪的欧洲，其实他们非常的不发达。
China and India and other places were much more advanced, but yet somehow science never really developed as it did in Western Europe.
相反，在那个时间在中国、在印度很多很多的科技然后就发展得很高超。但是如果要讲到现代的科学，好像并没有在这些国家发展起来。
There are several reasons for that, many of them interrelated.
有很多的原因，而且很多这些原因它们都是息息相关的。
And people still debate exactly what caused the beginning of the scientific revolution.
其实大家还是在争论，到底什么使得这一个科学的像个大爆炸一样，像是一个革新一样，它产生了。
But the evidence is very, very solid that Christianity played a very, very important pivotal role in the development of science.
但是我们有非常非常确凿的证据表明，基督教在现代科学的崛起当中发挥了关键的作用。
I am a Christian.
我是一个信耶稣的人。
My faith is in Christ alone.
那我的信心是单单建立在耶稣基督那里的。
And you might think that I'm a little bit biased when it comes to the history of science and Christianity.
所以如果我要是讲科学如果我要讲基督教的话，你可能会觉得我一定会有偏见。
And as I read this and did some research on this topic, one thing that really surprised me was how many non-Christians had written on this topic and come to the same conclusion.
但是当我在研究科学史的时候，当我在准备今天这个讲座的时候，我看了很多的资料，有一件事情让我非常的惊讶，就是很多的学者还有历史学家，他们研究过这些问题得出的结论，而且认为基督教对科学的崛起至关重要，但是他们自己并不是基督徒。
They concluded, like I have concluded, that Christianity was a pivotal, very important role in the rise of modern science.
对，他们认为基督教对科学它的是至关重要的，是起的是关键的作用。
As an academic, I'm used to giving quote resources.
那我既然是一个学者呢，我就是很习惯于提供各种各样的参考文献。
I don't know if you often have references in these talks, but again, I don't need to go through all this, but let me just go through some of these names. Again, there are many others, but these are some of the big ones that I came across.
好，我不知道在这样类似的讲座里面，是不是大家都给出这种参考的文献，但是我喜欢。那我现在罗列一些这些先讲一讲让我们看一下这些参考的文献。我不会讲很多很多，但是这些都是非常重中之重的这些人物。
Stephen Grauker something.
这个第一个人物叫做斯提凡，然后叫做 Gauk Roger 这个人。
He wrote that science could only arise in a religious culture.
他是这样说的哈，这个科学只能够出现在有宗教的文化当中。
And that science satisfied a unique theological aim that was unique to the Judean Christian West.
他说科学只能够出现在宗教文化当中它满足了一个自然的神学目标，这个就是犹太教和基督教它共有的这个西方所特有的。
He is not a Christian. I believe he's an agnostic and atheist. I don't know.
他不是一个基督徒，据我所知，他可能是一个无神论者，也有可能是一个不可知论者。
Peter Harrison has written several books. This is The Fall of Man, The Foundation of Science is one. I believe he's a Protestant Christian, but I'm not exactly sure.
好，这个下一个人叫彼得·哈里森，他写了几本关于科学和宗教的书，比如说这一本叫做《人的堕落》，还有这个科学的这个奠基，它的基础，科学基础。那么据我所知呢，他可能是一个新教徒。
Tom Holland is a historian.
好的，下面一个人他叫汤姆·霍兰德，他是一个历史学家。
According to him, without Christianity, we would not have science.
从他的角度来说，如果没有基督教，那么我们今天就没有科学。
One of the big theses he has is God is all-powerful, but yet God limits himself by making covenants with man, by declaring what he would not do.
它其中一个非常重要的主题，它就是说基督教的上帝是非常全能，是全能的。但是这位全能的神把他自己限制住了，让他服从契约。他跟亚伯拉罕有一个立的约。
He calls himself a cultural Christian because he agrees with much of Christianity, but he cannot consider himself a Christian because he can't make that decision to follow Christ.
对，他说他是一个文化上的基督徒，因为他认同这些观点，但是他自己不能够说他自己是个基督徒，因为他不愿意接受耶稣基督做他的救主。
Stanley Yaki was a Roman Catholic priest and a particle physicist.
下一位人他叫斯坦利·杰克，那么他是一个天主教的教父，神父，而且他是一个粒子物理学家。
And much of what he did describing what required for science, we'll talk about. He was a Catholic.
对，他讲了很多的工作，我们一会儿会聊到。那么他是一个天主教的教徒。
Robert Merton was a famous sociologist.
下一个是罗伯特·莫顿，他是一个很著名的社会学家。
And he argued that science arose basically in 17th century England because that was where the Reformation was most powerful.
他说，之所以科学是在17世纪的欧洲兴起来，就是因为那个时候有宗教的改革，宗教改革最强烈的地方就是这个科学兴起的地方。
It was largely the Puritan scientists who were trying to discover more about God that created the modern physics.
他说好像是清教徒，因为他们想要更加的了解神，更加了解神的荣耀，所以他们才积极的去发展科学。
He was a secular Jew who didn't really believe in God.
但是他是一个由世俗犹太人家庭出来的孩子，然后他从来就没有信仰过神。
Joseph Needham.
下一位是约瑟·尼坦。
He was a scientist. He studied a lot about science, and he's most famous for asking the question, why did modern science not start in China?
那他是一个很著名的科学家，他有一个非常著名的这个就是提的问题，他说为什么当代的科学没有在中国大量的出现？
China had the technology advanced, they had the communication, they had almost everything you'd think you would need for modern science, but somehow modern science never arose in China.
但是中国有那么高的科技，而且那么好的 communication. What's the meaning of communication?
So like you could communicate scientific advances and go at peace with each other.
对，那个时候就是有很好的这种交流，但是不知道为什么，就是这个最现代的这个当代的科学并没有首先从中国起飞。
That answer is still being debated, but he argued that a main part of it was the fact that Christianity is a monotheistic God, a rational God. The West had this rational God. They expected a rational creation. The Chinese didn't have that.
他说，其实我们今天还在争论这个问题，他的答案我们还在争论当中。但是这个人就是约瑟这个人，他得出的结论，他说答案很大程度是因为，基督教呢它是一神论的，但是中国人不太相信一神论，就是独一的神，唯一的一位神。但是基督教不仅信独一的神，而且还相信这位上帝他是有理性的，所以这位理性的上帝，独一的上帝，他会制定物理定律。
Rodney Stark has written a lot about science and Christianity and whatnot. He was not really a Christian for most of his life.
好，这个罗德尼 Stark 这个人，他是写过很多科学方面的书，但是他应该不是一位基督徒。
He was an agnostic for most of his life, but recently he became a Christian.
他一生当中大部分的时间，他都是一个不可知论者，但是最近他已经变成了一个信耶稣的人。
Alfred North Whitehead was a famous mathematician and philosopher.
他是这个下一个人是怀特海 Whitehead Alfred， 他是一个著名的数学家，也是一个著名的哲学家。
He described Christianity as the quote mother of science.
他把基督教称为科学之母，科学的母亲。
And the rationality of God in Judeo-Christianity that led to science.
因为他说是上帝的理性，就是犹太教和基督教共同相信的这个上帝的理性，使得基督教成为了科学之母。
He believed in God, but he was by no means a Christian.
他相信有神，但是无论怎么看他，他都不是一个基督徒。
He was probably what you would call a pantheist.
可能他可以被算成一个大家所说的泛神论者。
So again, many of these people were not Christian. Many of them were atheists, Marxists, but yet they saw how Christianity helped lead to science.
所以我们刚才所说的这些人，他们大部分的人，他们有的是不可知论者，有的是无神论者，还有的是一个马克思主义者。我忘了翻译了，刚才那个约瑟，他是一个马克思主义者。但是无论他还有一些是天主教徒，还有一些是基督徒。那无论是怎么样，他们都认为就是这个科学的发生跟基督教的这个信仰息息相关。
The ancient Greeks and Egyptians, Babylonians and Chinese and others all had great people who made some contribution to science.
那我们谈一下古希腊人呢、埃及人呢、巴比伦人呢、中国人呢，他们都在这个科学的建树上面做出过贡献。
For most of the Middle Ages, China and India and the Muslim empires were much more technologically advanced than Europe.
而且在中世纪的时候，如果我们比较一下中国啊、印度啊、穆斯林这些帝国啊，他们的技术和科技啊，要比欧洲先进得多。
Those cultures had great minds, made amazing discoveries.
这一些我们刚才提到的文化，他们都有伟大的头脑，而且他们都做出了惊人的发现。
Yet it was only in 17th century Europe that modern science arose.
但是是在17世纪的欧洲这个地方，然后科学才真正的起飞，就是当代的现代的这种科学真正的起飞。为什么？
And the question is why?
要问的问题就是为什么？
Several different reasons, many of them interrelated again.
有几个原因，然后其中很多是相互关联的。
But scholars have discovered something that seemed to be really effectively prohibit the development of science.
但是一些学者我们发现了，就是有一些什么事情就是相当阻挠这个科学的发生。我来讲几件。
Honestly, some science developed, but science can't really take off in a systematic way if people believe all these things.
对，如果人们相信的是我一会儿要讲的这些事情的话，那么那个科学是实在是进足不前的。
One thing that a lot of cultures had was a cyclical concept of time.
其中的一件就是很多的文化都相信时间是一个周而复转的这么一个概念。
Christian and science, history went in circles, and then the big circles and small circles.
我们的历史其实是在周而往复的，有大的循环，有小的循环。
One quote I saw, it was hard to overemphasize how damaging a cyclical concept of time is to developing a solid scientific system.
有一个地方我看到的他的引言就是说，其实这是有非常大的破坏性，我们怎么样强调都不会过分。就是这些时间观念如果是个循环的方面的话，但是它非常的妨碍这个坚实的科学系统的形成。
Honestly, the Judeo-Christian concept, God invented time at the beginning.
如果用我们这个就是犹太教或者基督教所相信的这位神的这种说明呢来说呢，就是我们的神他创造了时间这个概念。
You have something outside of time stepping in and making time.
他是在时间之外的，然后他创造了时间，然后他进入了时间之内。
And then time progresses until eventually times will end when Christ returns and establishes a new Jerusalem.
所以这个时间会一直持续下去，人类的历史会持续下去，直到有一天耶稣基督他再回来审判全地，有个新天新地会有建成。
Also, it's really hard to develop science if you think that nature is some type of a living organism.
那么第二个阻碍科学发展的就是有很多的文化里面有这么一个概念，就是认为就是自然就是被造的，其实是某一种活的有机体。
If you think that nature has some inherent will that possesses and wants to do things on its own.
那有些人他们就认为这个世界作为一个整体，它是有生命的存在的。 它是有它自己的意念的，就是这些被造物，它们其实有自己的意念的。
But if every little rock has its own independent will, it's hard to develop an overall theory of everything.
如果每一块小石头都有它自己的这种意念，那么相对来说，那它非常很难把这个万物作为一个整体来我们能够提炼出来一个自然的法则。
Some cultures, particularly for example in India, what you see, what your senses tell you is actually an illusion.
还有一些文明就是比如说在印度，他们有一种观念，就是我们的感官告诉我们的，其实不是那个真实的世界。
And honestly, if what you're seeing is just an illusion of the true reality, it makes it hard to do science and develop a theory that explains everything.
那如果我们感觉的其实是幻觉的话，那它肯定是妨碍我们发展真实的科学的。
That was a big concept in Hinduism, and it made its way into Buddhism and much of the Far East.
所以那个其实这种观点，它是从印度传到了，通过佛教传到了中国亚洲的大部分地区。
Another one is that mankind is simply part of nature, and just like everything else. Again, if we are part of it, how can we be expected to develop theories that explain everything?
还有一种看法，就是第四种看法了他说人类是需要跟那个大自然，就是被造之物是没有什么本质不同的。所以那如果我们跟大自然或者是这种被造之物没有本质的不同，那我们怎么可以脱离出来，然后呢去研究它，把它发展成科学呢？
There's several others, but the last one I want to talk about is it's hard to really develop science if you have a lot of pseudoscientific explanations that seem to explain everything, but they don't really explain anything.
还有其他的几件事情防止了科学的真正的发展。那么我最后再提一件，就是如果有伪科学的存在，就是这种伪科学什么都可以解释，但是实际上它又不能解释的时候，我们的科学就不能发展。
A notable example of this would be astrology.
比较好的例子就是比如说占星术。
If you think that everything is controlled by the position of the stars and the planets, then what hope do you have of developing a theory of how things happen just here on the earth?
如果我们生命当中的一切事情都可以用天象来解决，星星它们的位置然后这些，那它就会极大的阻碍我们去寻找在地上然后解释事情的这些可能。
If astrology can explain everything, why everything happens, which a lot of people thought, then why would you need to try to figure out on your own?
如果占星术呢，它什么都可以解释，就是发生什么都可以用占星术来解释，那么这地上的人可能就会觉得何必呢？我何必再去真正的去找它背后的解释呢？我就不需要努力了，反正占星术就可以帮我解释一切。
Astrology was widespread throughout the world, including Western Europe, even though it had been condemned repeatedly by the Christian church.
占星术它在全世界都是非常流行的，虽然说它被基督教屡次的谴责但是它在欧洲其实还是相当普遍。
But right around the 1600s, about 100 years before the scientific revolution began, the Reformation happened. Many people began to not believe in astrology, at least in the West.
但是在16世纪，就是宗教改革，然后那个就是在那个附近，然后占星术的信仰明显的在欧洲就减少了，它是直接跟当时的信仰，就是强调这个圣经有关系。
So these are some things that seem to have held back science arising in many places in the world.
我刚才讲的这些，他们都阻碍了科学在世界上许多其他的地方发展腾飞的这种可能。
So what was different about Christianity, particularly the 17th century Europe?
那我现在要问的就是，到底17世纪的欧洲是怎么样让科学蓬勃发展的呢？
So Genesis tells us that man was created by God in God's own image.
所以这个是创世纪我们的圣经第一本书第1章的27节说，神创造了人是照着他的形象的创造的。
God told man to have dominion over the earth.
神说我们要管理和治理这个地球。
Genesis 3 then talks about the fall of man into sin.
等到了创世纪的第3章的时候，圣经就记载了人是怎么样陷在罪里的。
Man is created as part of nature, but mankind is given a special ability because we alone are made in God's image.
人类虽然是上帝创造的一部分，但是它又特别特殊，因为我们的人，单单只有人有上帝的形象和样式。
There are many aspects of being made in the image of God, but one of them seems to be the fact that we have reason.
有神的样式其实有很多的方方面面了，但是其中一条就是我们能像神一样可以有推理的能力。
We have the ability to understand things.
我们有这个能力来理解事物。
Animals don't have that ability.
动物是没有这方面的能力的。
I've heard some people talk about humanity as being, quote, ugly bags of mostly water.
我曾经听说有人把我们人类描绘成就是这种很丑陋的袋子，存水的袋子，就是我们这是一个一个里面存满了水的丑陋的袋子。
Physically, we are just bags of mostly water.
但是如果我们真的是从我们的身体去理解，的确如此，我们就是一个一个行走的一个一个的水袋子，因为就是一个袋子里面装了大部分都是水。
But if you believe that you're just a bag of water and some other chemicals, then why would you ever expect that you could understand the world governing nature?
The world govern
the rules.
The rules govern nature. 所以，但是如果你相信了这种理论，你觉得我们就是行走的水袋子，或者是里面有一些其他的化学元素，那何必去认为那怎么可能我们会相信就是这个世界其实是有一些通用的法则在运转的呢？
But if you believe that you're made in the image of God,
但是如果你相信了你是按照上帝的形象所创造的，
and are given dominion over nature,
而且神把这个宇宙万物都放在你的权下，让你来管理。
and that the book of nature is written by the same hand who wrote the book of scriptures.
又讲到了2本书，圣经是神写的，然后被造之物也是神造的，就是我们所说的自然。这2本书是一位作者。
Then you would have a hope of understanding the book of nature.
Hope you will have a hope.
Yes, you could understand it.
那因为这样，你就有愿望，就是你也有可能去了解这个被造之物了，寻找它的规律了。
One thing that I hadn't noticed until just recently preparing for this talk was that a lot of the founders of science, that scientific revolution, often talk about the effect of the fall.
之前我不知道，但是最近这一段日子，当我准备这个今天的演讲的时候呢，我发现了一个事情是我以前不知道的，就是很多的科学的创始人，他们都受到了圣经当中关于堕落这个概念的影响。
The fall removed us from communion with God.
这个人的堕落使我们跟神隔离，不能再跟神这样自由的交通。
And the fall also corrupted our understanding of nature.
而且这个堕落也使我们对大自然，就是神被造之物，就是神创造之物，它的理解还有跟它的关系都被毁坏了。
And that was one of the big things that a lot of the Reformation talked about, the depravity of man. Our minds are no longer pure.
所以这就是我看到的很多很多的参考文献里面都是说人类的堕落就是导致我们一切的堕落。
Medieval science was largely based on the writings of Aristotle and some of the other Greek scientists, philosophers.
对，刚才讲的就是就是那个堕落，那个中世纪的科学主要是以亚里士多德和其他希腊哲学家的著作为基础的。
There were many incredible, talented thinkers like Aristotle, but they also did not have the concept of the fall.
他们都是非常有才华的思想家，但是因为他们没有这个就是人堕落的这个概念。
They thought they had reason, and that reason alone could allow them to discover everything.
所以他们就觉得用他们的理性就可以发现一切。
Many times the deductions, the reasoning was very valid, but the assumption that went behind it was wrong.
但是很多的时候，虽然他们的推理是正确的，但是推理之前的那个假设是错的。
Aristotle, for example, proved philosophically that it is impossible to have a vacuum.
亚里士多德，我来举个例子哈，他就从这个逻辑上面证明了真空是不可能存在的。
Again, the reasoning behind that argument was perfectly valid, but the assumptions he made for that argument was not.
他使用的这个推理是正确的，但是他使用的假设是不正确的。
And he thought his reasoning was so good, there was no reason to actually do an experiment to find out if those assumptions were right.
他觉得他的推理是那么的天衣无缝，然后他都不觉得他需要做任何的科学的试验去证明一下是不是他所有的假设都是对的。
And one of the main reasons behind the development of the modern scientific method was around the 16th century, 17th century, people began to doubt Aristotle.
那我们之所以开始了这种科学的实验呢，或是怎么样，就是之后，就是因为人们开始去怀疑亚里士多德到底说的对不对。
The reasoning might be good, but they decided they needed to check out those assumptions.
他们开始说亚里士多德可能的推理是好的，但是我们需要来检测一下他的就是之前的那些背景的这些假设是不是对。他要做一些检测。
Galileo, one of the founders of the scientific revolution, one of the most important, decided, well, let me look into the existence of a vacuum.
OK， 伽利略他就是一个就是这个科学起步当中最重要的一位人物，而且他也是一个奠基者之一非常重要。那么他就觉得需要去看一下亚里士多德。他对真空的这个发现是不是有一个假设上的错误？虽然他的推理是非常好的。
Galileo made many experiments, but he didn't have the technology to create a vacuum.
伽利略他做了很多很多的实验，但是他当时没有那个科技的水平，能够让他造出一个真空。
But he had already disproved some of the assumptions that Aristotle had made in his argument.
但是他已经把亚里士多德一些假设给推翻了。
And people were discussing.Is it possible, for example, that God could just take the earth and move the earth 3 feet that way all of a sudden?
因为当时的人们已经开始在说，上帝有没有能力把这个地球忽然之间向这边挪1米？
That's what they discussed in college.
这个就是他们当时在大学里面讨论的这问题之一。
And most of the people at the university, because they followed Aristotle, said no.
大部分当时在大学里面的学生或者老师，他们都说不这个不可能，神不可能这样做，因为他们是跟随着这个亚里士多德的这个学派。
Galileo said yes.
但是伽利略说可以的。
God is all powerful. If he wants to move the earth 3 feet that way, he can.
神是全能的，他要是想把这个地球挪1米，当然可以了。
The other said, well, the earth can't move 3 feet that way. There'll be a vacuum over here, and Aristotle proved there's not a vacuum.
但是其他的人就开始论证了，说上帝不可以的，因为他如果把这个地球突然间挪到这边来1米之外，那么他这个地方就留下了一个真空。但是亚里士多德已经证明了是没有真空的。
But Galileo said yes, and because of that, that was a big reason why he could develop his laws of motion.
但是伽利略坚持说是可以的，因为上帝全能，因为只要他愿意是可以的。所以呢，因为他这样的坚持，他就开始了动力学。
And it's really hard to overemphasize how important the fact that Aristotle and others began to doubt it. That Galileo and others began to doubt Aristotle.
对，我们刚才所说的这个伽利略和其他的人开始怀疑亚里士多德他的那个前提是不是错误，这个是非常重要的。这一点我们要强调再强调。
Robert Hooke, who developed a lot of things at the beginning of the scientific revolution, again, a very devout Christian, and he wrote that the reason that we had to do experiment is because of the fall, we cannot trust our reasoning perfectly.
那我们另外一个物理学的奠基人，他叫罗伯特·胡克，那么他也是一个非常虔诚的基督徒，他就写道，我们必须要用实验来发现这个被造的世界的真理。为什么呢？就是因为人的堕落。之所以人不能相信自己的推理，就是因为我们堕落了之后，连推理也堕落了。
Because of original sin, we must be doing experiment to discover about nature.
因为我们堕落的处在这个堕落的状态，所以我们必须要用实验来再次验证这个大自然界或者是被造界的这种它的公理。
And again, I was really surprised how common this view was made, not just by Huck, but many of the others of the early people in the scientific revolution.
所以在那个科学的这个改革的就是革命的那个时代里面，有那么多的人持有同样的观点，不仅是胡克一个人，是很多很多。所以这次我在预备的时候，我发现了，我也很惊讶。
We had the ability to reason, we had the ability to do science, but we must be guided by the two books of nature, the two books of God.
对，就是虽然我们的人可以有推理这个能力，而且我们就因为我们堕落了之后，所以我们必须要用上帝的2本书做指导，一本是圣经，还有一本呢就是神他的被造的。
Another really important concept that Christianity had that helped develop modern science is the belief that God is a God of order and not disorder.
好，基督教另外一个能够帮助我们科学发展的重要的概念呢，就是相信神是一位有秩序的神，而不是混乱的神。这个是在哥林多前书第14章33节里面讲到的。
There's a very famous quote by Eugene Wigner, who's a famous physicist, about the, quote, unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences.
我们有一个非常著名的文章他是一个物理学家，也是很著名的，他叫尤金·维格纳。他这个写了这个文章就是名字叫做《数学在自然科学中的不合理的有效性》。
Wigner's not very famous among the outside non-scientific world, but he's very well known within it.
这位维格纳教授呢，他在物理圈子之外好像不是那么出名，但是在物理圈，在科学界是非常出名的。
He was an atheist, but he regarded it as a miracle that mathematics allowed the formulation of the laws of physics that work so, quote, unreasonably well.
这个维格纳先生就是教授呢，他是一位无神论者，然而他认为数学让物理定律的公式如此不合理的巧妙的运作，这真的是一个奇迹。
A quote from this lecture he gave: "It is difficult to avoid the impression that a miracle confronts us here."
他曾经写到说，我们难免会有这样一种印象，我们在这里遇到了奇迹。
To the two miracles of the laws of nature and of human mind capacity to divine them.
Could you please give it? Let me read it. Can you point it out where it is? Okay. To the two miracles of laws, 就是说laws of nature and of the human mind's capacity to divine them. Oh, wow. 就是它有2个奇迹，一个是自然界是有那个规律的，还有一个呢就是人们的头脑是有能力的，然后去发现它们。这真的是一个奇迹。
He had no explanation for that miracle. It's just something that happened.
他说他没有办法能够解答这个奇迹，但是它就是发生了。
Einstein has lots of famous quotes, but one of his most famous quotations is that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible.
阿尔伯特·爱因斯坦他有一句名言，他就是说，关于宇宙最不可以理解的事情，就是它居然是可以被理解的。
Why is it that man, I mean, he didn't talk about bags of water, but why is it that little mankind can gain such an understanding of nature, of the universe?
虽然他没有把我们人形容成一袋一袋装着水的这种皮袋子，但是他呢就是在想，为什么这个人居然可以理解这个宇宙里面的这些事情。
Einstein did not believe in a personal God, but he did seem to believe in God, a God, supernatural being who created everything.
他虽然不太相信一位有人格化的这个上帝，但是呢，他还是能够认识到有一个超自然的存在。
Atheists just had to accept the fact that we happen to be incredibly lucky to be living in a universe that is so utterly and so comprehensible.
Yeah， 无神论者呢，他们只需要接受一个事实，就是我们非常幸运，因为我们生活在这样一个有序的而且容易理解的宇宙当中。
I personally know exactly why the universe is so utterly.
我个人其实我是非常知道为什么宇宙是这样有序的。
Because it declares the glory of God.
因为它是在述说着上帝的荣耀。
And also, as Paul wrote in Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly seen.
还有就是在罗马书的1章的第20节，是这样说的：自从造天地以来，神的永能和神性是明明可知的，虽是眼不能见，但借着所造之物就可以晓得。
So that people are without an excuse.
所以人是没有可以推诿的办法。
Robert Boyle, who's probably the founder of chemistry, here's a very devout question.
另外一位叫罗伯特·波伊尔，他是现代化学的创始人，他是一位非常敬虔的基督徒。
And as he studied God's creation, he began to realize that God would have not made the universe as it is unless he intended us to understand it.
当他研究上帝的创造物的时候呢，他就开始相信上帝不会来创造一个宇宙，除非他有意让我们要能够理解他。
Einstein wrote about how difficult it was psychologically to come up with an entirely new theory of something.
这个爱因斯坦他曾经说过，说这个是从心理学的角度来说，创造一个学科是非常非常难的。
To reject something that you have been taught time after time and come up with a new theory, it's very, very difficult to do that unless you have a good reason to believe that there's underlying order within nature.
他说，当我们接受的教育呢，我们想要创造新的，就得要否定旧的。我们要把那个接受来的这个教育一遍一遍的否定，然后创造一个新的学科。那其实是极其难的，除非我们相信，就是这个世界或者这个被造物是我们可以理解的。
Those scientists who started the scientific revolution believed that God created everything and that everything declared the glory of God.
这些科学家们，他们是相信有秩序的创造的，然后因为他们相信创造了秩序的上帝。
They believed in an orderly creation because they believed in a God of order who created it.
对，他们相信有秩序的创造，因为他们相信的是上帝是有秩序的。
Science depends on an orderly universe that behaves in a particular regular way.
科学依赖的是一个有序的宇宙，它是以一种特定的有规律的方法运行的。
And why would they believe that?
为什么他们这样相信呢？
C.S. Lewis, a famous apologist from the 20th century, said that man became scientific because they expected law in nature.
这是一位非常有名的护教学的20世纪著名的基督徒的作家，他叫鲁易士。他写到，人们之所以成为科学家，是因为他们期待这个被造当中的规律。
And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver.
他们之所以期待大自然，就是我们的被造物当中有规律，是因为他们相信那有一位给这个自然规律的，就是神。
And again, this happened in the West because Western Europe believed in that the natural the lawgiver.
之所以这个科学发展是在欧洲发生的，就是因为欧洲的人民当时是相信这一位给予宇宙万物一个自然规律、被造物规律的这位神。
I can give many examples, but let me talk about just a handful.
我可以给出很多很多的例子来，但是今天我就讲几个。
Copernicus developed kind of the first beginning of the scientific revolution when he developed the heliocentric, the sun-centered universe.
哥白尼他就是其中的一个就是科学大革命的一个奠基者，他是在提出的想法就是以太阳为中心，太阳系。
Aristotle, Ptolemaic, most of the other Greek philosophers believed that the earth was in the center of everything and everything moved around the earth.
亚里士多德还有普托勒梅，对这个人，还有他们其他的一些哲学家都说地球才是宇宙的中心。
Basically, everybody of his day believed that in Europe.
基本上在哥白尼时代的其他的人，就是当时在欧洲的人都这么相信。
Copernicus was a Catholic priest, and he looked at the old system, and he saw that it didn't seem to reflect the order that he expected.
但是哥白尼他是一个天主教的神父，当他在观察那个旧的体系的时候呢，他并没有反映出来他所期望的一个很漂亮的秩序。
He was, and I'm quoting him, annoyed that the movements of the world machine created for our sake by the best and most systematic artist of all, we quote, so disordered.
对，他就是我们来引一下他的原话，他就是说，哎呀，我好恼火呀！为什么呢？因为他是由我们这个世界机器的运转，应该是由那个最优秀的、最系统的工匠为我们设计的，就是神创造的，怎么会这么的这个乱糟糟的？所以他感到很恼火。
From what he had been taught, it seemed seemed absurd to consider everything from the heliocentric universe, but he decided to see what would happen. Could he describe the motions of the planets and everything around the sun?
所以他就在他考虑从太阳是那个世界的就是太阳系的中心的时候呢，其实他心里面是很难受的。他说这似乎很荒谬，但是呢，他又渴望一个就是更有序的宇宙模型，所以他就这样做了假设。
And he did this because he thought that the universe was made for us by a supremely good and orderly creator.
因为他认为我们这一位创造者就是我们的神，他是一个最优秀的，然后最有秩序的、最好的最棒的这么一位。
And God's nature should be revealed in the creation.
所以神的这个特性呢，应该在他的被造里面能够彰显出来。
Now, there's nothing wrong with the old theory that science experiments and observation has shown. There's no reason, according to the observation, to prefer his theory to the other theory.
但是其实旧的体系并没有什么明显的错误，它也没有什么观察到的东西比较一下这个新的这个模型。
But he chose to have everything moving around the sun because he thought that was more orderly, more like what God would have done.
但是他还是选择了日心说，为什么？就是因为这个模型看起来更加的漂亮，更加的有序。他觉得我要选择它，因为我相信，如果是有个好的有序的造物主，那么他所创造出来的太阳系应该是这个样子的。
Galileo, the first to really formulate science in terms of mathematics.
伽利略是第一个用数学来表达科学的人。
Did a lot to create modern physics, modern science, especially the idea of motion.
他是这个对现代的物理现代的科学，特别是运动定律，他都是有相当的超现代理解的人。
He was very devout, and again, he thought that yes, nature can be described using the language of mathematics because nature is created by such an orderly being.
他是一个非常敬虔的基督徒，那么他也是第一个通过观察自然，就是被造物之后，将这些归纳为数学性质的人，因为他相信我们的神是非常的有秩序的。
God is known by his nature, his works, and by the doctrine in his revealed world.
对，他写的是说神他被我们知道是通过被造物，还有他的这个手所做的大功，还有他的这些神学的这些，还有在他彰显出来的圣经里面所彰显出来的这个神学。
He read his Bible and he studied God's nature.
所以又是这两本书了，他读了他的圣经，就是神启示出来的话，而且他研究这个被造之物，因为这也是神的手所做的功。
Kepler was a mathematician and astronomer.
开普勒呢，他是一位数学家，他又是一位天文学家。
He came up with the laws of planetary motion.
他最著名的就是他的行星运动的三定律。
And he proved that Copernicus' conjecture was correct.
然后他就证明了这个哥白尼还有另外一个人伽利略是正确的。
Again, what he was seeking was some fundamental laws the rules that God set up how planets should move.
所以他就他 one more time.
He was looking for simple, orderly laws, fundamental laws that would describe how the planets would move.
OK， 他也是在寻找一个非常简洁的、非常漂亮的这么一个模型，来证明就是行星绕着太阳的运作。
He had actually wanted to study to become a priest.
所以他其实一开始的时候学习是想要成为一个神父。
And he became of the opinion that astronomers are priests of Almighty God with respect to the book of nature.
所以他当时认为，如果我改去学天文物理学的话，那个也是一个敬虔的像神父一样的工作，因为我是在那个研究神所创造的这个被造物，然后呢，我去敬拜神。
The chief aim of all investigations he wrote was to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed upon it by God.
他说，所有研究外部世界的主要目的，都应该是发现理性和秩序的和谐，这是上帝加给他的，赋予给他的。
Newton is probably the most important person in the history of science.
如果说是历史上科学历史上面最重要的人物，应该就是牛顿了。
His laws of motion and other things laid out the framework for doing physics until the 20th century.
对他的这个物理的方法，特别是运动和力这个概念，为物理学奠定了框架，直到20世纪。
He discovered the law of universal gravitation.
他发现了万有引力定律
which was important for a lot of things, but one of the most significant things was it unified. It was the same law here on Earth as what was happening up in the heavens and the planets.
但是这个万有引力从哪个方面看都是非常重要的，但是它之所以独特呢，就是因为它是第一个科学定律，可以既应用在地球表面，甚至应用在行星和恒星的领域。
He did major work in a lot of areas of science, ranging from motion to heat flow, optics, and just about everything else.
在其他的科学领域当中，他也有很多的建树，包括运动啊，包括热流啊，包括光学啊，甚至以及几乎其他所有的领域。
He's even credited by some for inventing the doggy dog, except for the cat dog.
然后甚至有的人说，那个我们家里面那个小门让狗进出，然后让猫进出的那个门也是他设计的。
And he would often write in the scientific papers about how his results show that the reason this works is because there's an intelligent and powerful being who governs all things and set up these laws of motion, of the laws of whatever else he was doing.
他常常在他的科学论文当中是这么写到，他的研究结果表明，只有一位智慧的、强大的、统治万物的这一位神，才能创造这样一个系统包括这些运动啊和力啊这些系统。
He invented calculus just so that he could do the physics.
他就是创造了这个微积分，为的就是能够继续的，然后研究他的物理。
He did incredible work in many areas of physics, but yet he said that he's much more interested in theology than he was in science.
他在科学方面的建树还有数学方面的建树真是相当的了不起，但是他自己承认说他对神学的兴趣远远超过了他对科学的兴趣。
And he actually wrote more about theology and religion than he did about science.
但是他写的更多的这些宗教方面的文章啊，然后超过他科学方面的文章。
Just yesterday in my physics class, I was talking about James Clerk Maxwell.
就是昨天我在上我的物理课的时候呢，我谈到了麦克斯韦，就是雅各·克拉克 Clerk 麦克斯韦这个人。
He did a lot of things, but he's most famous for collecting what's now called Maxwell's equations.
在他的科学生涯当中，他做了很多的事情，但是最著名的就是他把4个方程式集结起来，叫做麦克斯韦方程。
These 4 equations describe just about everything in physics about electricity, magnetism, and how electric and magnetic fields arise.
然后他这个4个方程好了不起，因为他描述了所有这个关于电和磁这方面的工作还有他们之间的关系。
He did not write these equations, he just gathered them together.
不是他把这些这方程写出来的、创造出来的，他只是把这4个方程把它放在一起。
But he made one little change in one equation.
但是呢，他就在其中的一个方程，第4个方程那个地方，他加了一个小小的东西。
Ampere's law said that you could have a current that produces a magnetic field, but under certain situation, you would have a magnetic field here and a magnetic field here, and then right in between there wouldn't be a magnetic field.
安培法律呢，律法安培这个规则，它是说你如果有电流的话，就可以形成一个磁场。但是呢，有一种情况，磁场是不连续的，你可以在这个地方有个磁场，在这个地方有个磁场，但是中间是没有磁场。
There's no way of testing that with what they had at the time, but he knew God was a God of order. He was a very devout Christian, and he just did not believe that God would have magnetic field, and then nothing in between.
所以他是一个非常敬虔的基督徒，那他又是极度的相信神一定是一个有秩序的神。那他就是说，神创造的这种现象是不可能只是在这个地方有磁场，这个地方有磁场，中间是没有磁场的，所以他觉得这个事情是不可能的。
And so because of that, he added this one extra little term over here.
就是因为这个他的这个理念，他就在这个第4个方程式里面加了最后这一项。
No experimental evidence that term was needed, but he just thought that God is a God of order and it needed to be there.
就是他当时是没有这个实验的这个水平能力的，是绝对没有办法测，就是在实验室当中测出来的。但是因为他相信神是一位有秩序的神，他就在这个地方加了这一项。
By adding that extra term, he could prove that light was an electromagnetic wave.
所以他说加了这一项之后呢，他就可以证明这个光其实是一个电磁波。
He could use these equations to calculate the speed of light.
他就可以用这些方程呢，很容易的计算出来光速。
Eventually, somebody proved this just about the time just after he died, but he didn't need the proof. His proof was in the order of creation because it reflected a good and utterly God creator.
就是很多年的之后，几乎是他死掉的时候，然后才有人用实验能证明了，也验证了他这个猜想。但是他当时是不需要有人来验证的，因为他所有的这一些这个大胆的假设是基于他对神的信心，因为他知道神是一位有序的、合理的这个上帝。
Talk a little bit more, but these people talked about the laws of nature. When you go into your physics class or chemistry class, the laws of nature are presented as something intrinsic to nature.
当我们无论去什么科学方面的课程的时候呢，那你可以看到这个 laws of nature 就是那个被造物它的法则，其实它是深深的它是在那个所有被造的东西它这个里面的这个一个本性。
When these people talked about the laws of nature, they were talking about the laws imposed upon nature by the lawgiver.
但我们谈论的是自然这个法则是宇宙固有的定律，但是他们谈论的时候呢，他们都认为一定是有一位造物主，他把这个法则放在这个宇宙当中。
I'm running a little bit low on time, but hopefully I can come back another time and finish talking about this topic.
我今天的时间不够了，但是希望有机会能够再回来，那我就可以继续的讨论这个主题。
There's a really important discussion about why did these scientists actually do the science.
那今天有一个非常重要的这种就是对话或者是讨论，就是为什么这些科学家要从事科学研究。
And it seems silly to talk about why somebody would do science.
这个就从我们的角度来说，这是一个多么愚蠢的问题啊！为什么你要讨论这个科学家为什么要做科学研究呢？
So many benefits from science, but at the time, nobody saw these benefits.
因为我们知道这个科学也很有好处，但是当时在他们那个年代，这些科学其实一点好处都没有。
How many people in the 17th century world were helped by knowing about the laws of planetary motion?
请问一下，多少人就是活在17世纪的时候，他们可以经常使用行星运动定律吗？
But those same laws of planetary motion describe how satellites move around the Earth. We use satellites for weather satellites. we have a GPS, your phone, my phone. They depend on satellites, the laws of planetary motion that was such a big deal about physics.
那么今天就不一样了，我们用到这个行星运动定律，我们可以使用卫星啊，因为这个他们是遵循行星和卫星相同的运动规律啊。那么我们可以今天通过我们的手机，然后通过这个卫星得到这个天气的信息，我们可以使用全球卫星定位导航系统，然后在你的手机、我的手机里面都有。所以
Again, I hope to talk more about that later, but again, the reason they did this, give you the answer real quick, they wanted to glorify God.
所以我们将来如果再回来的时候，可以继续的多讨论这方面的问题。但是我今天可以给你一个很快速的答案。他们之所以要研究科学，就是因为他们要荣耀他们所相信的这一位上帝。
Because many people argue that science and Christianity have already been at war.
所以有的人就说，科学和这个基督教总是在敌对的状态当中。
But I think it's very obvious when you look at the history of science. It was Christianity that helped lead to the formation of modern science.
但是如果我们去看一下这个科学的历史，那就是非常容易就得出来一个结论，就是基督教才成为当代科学的基石。
People trying to understand the laws that the law gave to science.
因为大家都想要去这些科学家他们想要去研究这些被造物的规律，而且来荣耀这位创造这一切的主。
And again, I'd like to, if possible, come back again in a few weeks and talk more about this.
好，可能几周之后，希望有机会再回来。